All right, everybody, this is Mr. Herzl, and this week we're going to be talking about some important individuals during the American Revolution. So if this is your first time hearing this lecture, that's awesome. If you're here for a review, that's okay too. We're going to walk you through it, and if you're here for a review, I'll probably say some things that you didn't hear from your teacher. They probably said different things than me, and that's always a good thing because you get more information. So let's jump in. All right, so this is very simple. We usually have this page that shows the TEKS, and that is what the state of Texas wants you to know, so it's really important that we focus in on those things, but that's all we're talking about this week, so there's no other information. It's just what's on the TEK 8.4b, which is these individuals. All right, so Mercy Otis Warren. You have this quote from her that says, "The British were indeed very far superior to the Americans in every respect necessary to military operations, except the revivified courage and resolution, the result of sudden success after despair." So, her husband sat down to write a letter to Congress, and Warren wasn't really happy at the patience Congress was showing towards England. So she was kind of a fiery person, like a Sam Adams, and so, but for a woman at that time, it was difficult. You would have to have your husband do that, Unfortunately, back then, women weren't, they couldn't be as vocal politically. They had to kind of go through their husbands to get things done. But what we see in the Revolution is that some women actually kind of started to bypass that process. And so she did that, and basically, she told her husband she knew that she couldn't write the letter. It wouldn't have as much impact or power back then if it came from a woman, which is ridiculous. We know that, but that's just the way that it was back then. We don't judge the past by our standards today. So she told her husband to write this. "You, Congress, should not piddle at the threshold. It's time to leap into the theater, to unlock the bars, and open every gate that impedes the rise and growth of the American Republic." So very patriotic. She wanted to completely separate. She totally disagreed with the Tories, the Loyalists. She's America's first female playwright, so she would write plays. One of the things that she could do, and people would take her seriously at, was her writing. And so she would write plays that made fun of the British. And that's a very impactful way to get your message out into the public, is to not maybe directly go out on a soapbox, stand up and start yelling in the street, but instead to do it in ways that were more acceptable at the time for a woman, which this was an example of that, writing a play. So there's some pictures of her. Right, so this also says that she attended town and government meetings and took notes. She eventually wrote the first history of the Revolutionary War. So that's another really impactful thing. Usually people writing these histories are the generals that were there, or the politicians, or, we have all of these writings from our founding fathers, but this is a writing from our founding mother. So she intentionally went. She wanted to know and tell the story of the American Revolution because she felt so passionately about it. Abigail Adams. Usually Abigail Adams is known as the husband of John Adams and the mother of John Quincy Adams. So John Quincy Adams is going to be a president a little bit later, but John Adams is our second president. And of course, John Adams is he is important prior to the Revolution and after the Revolution. But historians, they will tell you that if you study John Adams, really the brains behind John Adams was Abigail. Abigail was the person kind of in that role where, again, at that time, there was a limitation on how influential she could be because she was a woman. And so she had to use her influence to influence her husband. But people started to realize that Abigail Adams was very intelligent. She had these great ideas. And so even people like George Washington would go seek out Abigail Adams and talk to her and ask her questions. And a lot of people respected Abigail far more than they respected John Adams. All right. So again, she's most famously known as a First Lady of the United States for her husband, John Adams. She obviously, John Adams was he was in France negotiating for their help during the war. He also later on goes to England and is an ambassador to England at a certain point in time for our country. And so if you're a mother of 3 kids and you have to stay and deal with those, deal with that family and take care of it alone, it's a sacrifice that she made while also being very influential politically. Right, there's probably the most famous picture ever. Right, when the British fired on Boston Harbor, she famously led other women to make bullets for the war effort out of metal from their homes. So they're literally breaking down their homes and making bullets for the war effort. Pretty inspiring stuff. Right? And again, she advised many leaders, including George Washington, which I already stated. All right, so John Adams, obviously I just talked about him. He was the husband of Abigail Adams. So he's an original delegate of the Continental Congress. So he's one of the first delegates of the Continental Congress. He was a diplomat to France during the American Revolution. He's important in securing French support for America. It's very important that we were able to do that. We wouldn't have been able to win the war without his support and his being able to negotiate those things. And he's going to become the first vice president during George Washington's presidency, and then he's going to become the second president of the United States. But as far as the American Revolution, probably the most important thing is he helped negotiate France's entry into the war. Thomas Jefferson. Of course, we know Thomas Jefferson famously wrote the Declaration of Independence. We love the Declaration of Independence. Everybody loves to talk about it. So Thomas Jefferson, probably more books written about him than almost anybody else other than Abraham Lincoln. And so he not only wrote the Declaration of Independence, but he wrote a lot of really good material in support of breaking away from England. All right, and there's a portion of the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so in that statement, you have him saying that government doesn't give you rights. Government doesn't give you rights, and so government can't take them away. So God gives us rights, and so no man can take those rights away. And it's very powerful, especially when you're trying to break off from an England who is perceived and is taking away some of those rights right there. All right. He also served as a member of the Continental Congress during the American Revolution. And later, he's going to serve as a diplomat to France, and he's going to be there during very important portions of our American history, while our Constitution's being written. Much of the time during the war, he's there as well, and he eventually becomes the 3rd president of the United States of America, and he's famously a part of one of the first parties in America, the Democratic Republicans. And so he's kind of the founder of the party system in America that we have today. Benjamin Franklin, very interesting person. So Benjamin Franklin, during the American Revolution, is not a young buck, he's not a young person. He's actually quite old, and so he's kind of the wise old grandfather of the founding fathers. So he was one of the Committee of Five from the Continental Congress who drafted the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson had portions of the Declaration that actually spoke out against slavery, and Benjamin Franklin came in and said, "Yeah, that's good and all, but how are we going to get the South to go along with this?" And so they made these compromises and edited the Declaration of Independence, which Jefferson, by the way, hated. He hated being edited. He almost didn't start writing in the first place, almost didn't even volunteer to do it because he didn't want to be edited. So, meaning he didn't want somebody to go and write, take apart his writing and rewrite it. But he's Benjamin Franklin's one of the wise old people that says, we need to bring the South and the North together, so let's not talk about that. The only American to sign the Declaration of Independence, the Treaty of Paris, and the Constitution. So again, he's there during the Treaty of Paris in France. He's there earlier on when we declare independence, and then he's there later on when we write and sign the Constitution. And so again, he's another one of those people who was sent to France where he negotiated with the French. And he's probably the most famous person who was negotiating with the French. Actually became really well known in France and really well liked by the French people, and was able to convince that government to, after the Battle of Saratoga, to come along and support the American Revolution on the colonist side. James Armistead. So James Armistead was born into slavery in Virginia around 1748. With the permission of his master, Armistead enlisted in the Continental Army under General Lafayette. And you may think that's strange, like, well, how could he enlist? But sometimes the people who owned slaves, those slaves would then ask if they could go and do certain things, or maybe they would go work in a certain other town and send a little bit of money back, or they would go and learn a trade so that they could employ it or work after they had gotten done their work for the person who owned them. And so this is a good example of something like that. James Armistead, he wants to volunteer for the Continental Army, and so he did that. Right, so he gains the trust of British General Cornwallis and Benedict Arnold. So those are, and he is going to, intelligently towards the end of the war, he says, I can gain the trust of these individuals as a slave because I can tell them, hey, I'm against slavery. I want to be free. I want you guys to set us free. The British during that time were using slavery to recruit a lot of black slaves and use those slaves as soldiers against the colonists. And so he was able to use that, what they were doing, and say, yeah, I'm one of those people who is mad at my master and I want to fight with you. And so Benedict Arnold, who was then a traitor and had moved over to the British side, and Cornwallis, they trusted him. And so he was able to get information from them, which then helped George Washington. Probably we wouldn't have had we may have still won the war since we then had France on our side, but we wouldn't have had such an amazing victory at the very end of the war, with the British surrendering at the end of the war there. So yeah. Information he provides is seen as the key to, and that's what I was talking about, Yorktown. Sorry, I was having a mind blank there. But so his information allowed us to have that decisive victory at Yorktown, where, the British are surrounded basically by either French boats or American troops on the peninsula there. All right, Haym Salomon. You can see that plaque there. Financier of the Revolution, came to America 1772, imprisoned by the British 1776 and 1778, lived in Philadelphia 1778 to 85, active in its Jewish community, a broker. He lent money heavily to support the war, never repaid. He himself died in debt. So he is seen as the person who raised money. So he had quite a bit of money at the beginning of the war, and he was able to raise money from around him and give his own money to the war effort on the American side. And that's why the British wanted to put him in prison, and eventually did. So he was a Polish immigrant. He played an important role in the American Revolution by loaning money to America, which is what I just said. And he single-handedly kept the war effort alive with the money that he... Marquis de Lafayette. All right, that's French. France, blah, blah. It's kind of how French people talk when we hear them with our dialect compared to theirs. So originally, Marquis de Lafayette is from France. He is from France. He volunteered. He traveled to America during the war to help with the war effort against England. He's going to become really close friends with George Washington and has a huge impact on the way that that camp is set, the way that the soldiers are going to drill, the way that the order that they have, supply lines, all kinds of things he brought from the French army to the American army. So America, remember, they're just a bunch of ragtag farmers and people who didn't really know anything about war. And he's from France, and France has been fighting, England ever since, there was a France in England. And so they have very developed tactics in war. And so he's able to come over and help George Washington. Very influential. And if if you look back at that time period, even 100 years after, if you use that name, there are people during the Civil War that said, that lied and said, well, I'm a descendant of Marquis de Lafayette, and people would give them, a lot of respect just because of that. So he's a very famous individual in American history. He went on to lead American forces in many successful battles. And he led the siege on Yorktown until Washington joined his forces and they overtook Cornwallis. So again, he's very important. He's there at the very end of the war. He's seen as someone who, again, the French came in and turned the tide, but there were individual French generals who came and helped turn the tide of the war. Traveled back to France directly after the war and helped negotiate the Treaty of Paris. All right, George Washington. We all know George Washington. So George Washington we all know him from the French and Indian War, and he had these, massive defeats. They weren't massive, but they were defeats. And so, you have this person who is really the only well-known person from America's military, other than we had a few, but George Washington's the best known. And so he is chosen by the Continental Congress to represent and lead the Continental Army. And so, he's going to go through those early phases where they're suffering those defeats, and he's going to take an army, a ragtag group of soldiers, and he's going to turn them into an army. And he'll get help along the way. But, they were in situations multiple times like Valley Forge where they didn't have anything. They had nothing. So you've got massive amounts of sickness in the camp, and you've got people with no shoes, and there's no food, and George Washington somehow is able to convince these troops to stay on for the most part. And so, he also leads these very successful battles later on in the war as well. And so, he's going to be the person most well known and most responsible for the victory that America has during the American Revolution, which will eventually make America want to make him the first president of the United States. Okay, so that's all. This is a short one, only 17 minutes, but hopefully you got some great information, and I hope you'll be able to, take whatever test you have to take and be successful. All right, until next time, we'll see you guys.